His novels are world famous, and his book, The War Against Cliché, proves him to be one of the select few critics who raise literary journalism to an art form. He has always found talking on television impossibly restrictive, but this is the first interview in which he has been allowed to smoke and have a drink while doing so.
Martin Amis, novelist and critic. These two things don't often happen nowadays, do they? Very much.
It's true, and it's like, the poet-novelist. There's Updike, and I think, then Nabokov, but they're a dying breed and have been for some time. We live, and indeed, but we live in the time of increasing specialization.
I hate it.
Yeah. It's very inhibiting, I think, and it also makes people more remote from each other, and they have their own value systems, and the community, the intellectual community, is gone.
Well, I must say that I think you're the kind of critic that a novelist ought to dream of, because you stay with an author that you appreciate, and somebody like Philip Roth, for example.
But he doesn't appreciate it.
Then exactly, because you actually take the novelist at his best estimation, and you can be very, very tough when you think singing below it. I was very interested in your criticism of Roth. First of all, I agree with you. I think our whole generation agrees that no author in modern history made a more stunning beginning than Portnoy's Complaint.
Well, that was his fourth novel.
We call it his beginning. Well, you think of it.
Yeah, he did the Prentice work, and then comes the Talent novel, and that was his Talent novel, where he said goodbye to form and trusted to the voice. And it was a stunning appearance.
I've got my favorite scenes and even my favorite lines, and where he's frantically trying to impress the Wasp Bill and pretending he's not Jewish, he's not Portnoy, and he calls himself Port Noir.
And when he's grilling his friend who's just had fellatio from the Italian ironing lady, whose complaint, and he says, right after you left, she was down on her lousy Dago knees performing fellatio. And he says, tell me everything about it. Tell me about it in incredible detail. Do you put it in, or does she put it in, or does it just get drawn?
And you can hear the rhythm in the prose. He was unbeatable at writing spoken.
Wonderful, wonderful ear. But he's shortchanged us a bit on the humour, hasn't he? I mean,
well, you say so, and I think you think a bit less of the Zuckerman books as a whole than I do. But it's undoubtedly true that he got less funny.
He hoarded his, he's a humour hoarder, and you do want him to. He always strikes me as a writer who's looking for a decorous way to explode, as I put it. Because he's a great moralist as well, and a great product of the crew-necked, serious 50s, and he would have read his Leavis and his.
Oh, sure, and he was a great student. His essays on Kafka are impeccably crafted academic works, in addition to everything else they are. I think he hit a new phase of outrage actually in Israel and later on.
The Counterlife was a liberating book for him, and kind of such a perfect postmodern novel that it retires the genre in a way.
He does raise a question, which I think your whole book of criticism raises, and your whole attitude towards it. You have very, very high aesthetic requirements, and you identify the aesthetic performance with morality. In fact, morality is contained within aesthetics. And I just wonder to what extent that it's true. It's true, but is it true enough? Because there surely must be some such thing as a great stylist who you also find does not make an adequate approach, response to morally to life.
Well, I've been looking at the Stalin period, and there you see crystallized the real crux of writing as it relates to politics. There are only three things you could do under the regime, which is silence. Was it Babel who said, "I've invented a new genre, that is silence"?
And even that could be dangerous.
That could be dangerous.
cooperating with the regime.
Bad books.
Bad books. Or suicide. Defamation of some kind, deformation, or suicide. And what Stalin did, and what Hitler did, and what politics does do, in more or less extreme cases, is that you find out how good you are. Because if you're good, only luck can save you. As it said, Pasternak, for instance. Because you can't cooperate, because it is of the soul. And if you do, Gorky is the most tragic example, who wavered back and forth, and then when he did, he refound his integrity, which had been, prostituted on several occasions. Then, it seems likely that Stalin rubbed him out. But he had the most deformed experience. Mayakovsky, I think talented, don't you?
He's hugely talented.
Yeah, and suicide,
As they say in Russia, he stepped on the throat of his own song. He finally found that the only way to stop writing was to die. Yeah.
So usually writers never find out how good they are, because the argument starts with the obituaries, and that keeps you honest. But in Russia, you found out.
Well, I must say I'm putting myself in danger, because the danger with the argument that I'm propounding is that the people who actually do treat the big subjects in spite of all, like Nadezhda Mandelstam, who did write a great book.
It's a great book.
Hope Against Hope is a truly great book, and so is the second book, Hope Abandoned. I think there's probably if I say, it's probably meaningless to say so, but it was a great prose book of the century. I would call it Hope Against Hope. But there's a great danger in, there's a great...
The Gulag Archipelago.
Well, that's a greatly effective book, but I think Hope Against Hope,
could be argued.
But the danger is to think that it takes extreme experience to make greatness, and I don't quite believe that. It's more common that extreme experience will distort it will bleach out all the rest of life. And Nadezhda Mandelstam said so, that the trouble with our experiences is that it removed us from the privilege of ordinary heartbreaks of everyday life.
Yeah.
That's the weakness in my argument I already know, but the point I keep returning to, especially with Borges, is that this is the fundamental condition of the country you're living in. So you have to say, if you don't treat it or take it in any way, or even pointedly ignore it, you're really saying you're living in another world, which is the aesthetic world. There's a danger of an aestheticized world.
Well, I mean, every writer would have to consider how he or she would behave in similar circumstances. How would you do under Stalin? I know how I would do. I would write, I would be called in after a while. Then I would write 4 or 5 short stories about, love beneath the tractor, or,
No, you would have been...
Then I would kill myself.
You would probably be Bulgakov, whose destiny was far more contorted than that, and wrote some very, very important books, and then broke his heart. And I know what would happen to me. In my wish, I would emigrate immediately. In fact, a little bit before the revolution, which is more or less what Nabokov did, was it not?
Well, during the revolution, he was in the Volga getting on this boat.
That would be my wish, and I would go into exile and become an important international writer. But what I fear, and I think I try and follow La Brière's precept that self-indulgence and severity towards others are the same vice. In other words, you should judge yourself as harshly as possible in the light of what you know about yourself. And I've got a terrible feeling I would have been Ilya Ehrenberg.
Not a bad destiny.
No, but a very bad man. He was.
Was he a very bad man?
Yes, he was a bad man. But he did some good things because of his position, and he achieved his position as basically being a slavish writer for the regime. Because of his position, he was able to do good things, help people. But on the whole, it was a very, very sad career as a lickspittle and a cat's paw. And I've got a terrible feeling that might have been me just to save my ass.
But he had talent and somehow compromised it. But it's journalistic talent, right? But if you had solid talent, I don't think you could do it, because your heart becomes gangrenous in your body when you go against your talent. And Borges, I think it's a harsh reading of Borges.
It's not my reading. It's actually reading of perfectly civilized Argentinians, and it's a recurring theme with them. And because they're trying to come to terms with a past that won't go away. In fact, it's probably going to come again.
Well, what about Céline as an example?
Céline he's a perfect nightmare, and
yes, he is. And also, if you write anti-Semitic fiction, that's one thing. If you write anti-Semitic how-to books about getting rid of Jews.
Bagatelles for a Massacre is one of the filthiest books that anyone ever wrote. It's not so much a matter of Journey to the End of the Night. Bagatelles for a Massacre is a prescription for wiping out Jews. There's a very good story about Celine, which I've only just read, actually. In 1941, a lot of the French right-wing writers went on a tour of Germany and Vienna to meet the top Nazis, Sepp Dietrich, sit down together, discuss the future of Europe, United Europe.
What year?
1941. And it was called, I think it was called the Schriftstellertreffung or something, the meeting of writers. They meet the top Germans. Goebbels was there. Great meeting, great scene, great play. These rather second-rate French writers finally came back to Paris, and Celine met them. And he screamed at them. He said, "You didn't say enough about killing Jews. There was nothing about killing Jews. I've read everything you said. Where is the real subject?" Of course, the Nazis knew the real subject, and so did Celine, but the second-rate French writers hadn't guessed it yet. Celine was a perfect.
Yeah, swine. But do you admire him?
No, I don't. But that's because my French isn't really good enough to read. Voyage à bout de la nuit is meant to be a good book. But
I've never got far with it. No. But do we allow the possibility
of a great Nazi writer or a great? We're much less likely to allow the possibility of a very, very great right-wing writer than a
great left wing. Yeah.
I don't mind putting aesthetics as the supreme criterion as long as it contains morality. It's when the two things get separate that things get extremely.
Nothing can ever get separated on these. It's convenient to do so for the purposes of analysis, but it's all one thing.
Can a writer get derailed by his own subject matter? I've been fascinated for a while now by the case of Nicholson Baker, whom you put me onto, and I enjoyed Nicholson Baker's books. I enjoyed them as any. So the book about Updike was just screamingly an interesting book.
And you're right, as you said long ago, originality is talent, and he is original.
And he was the Microscopic Vision and the Perfect Registration was.
And also the blandest, most beautifully bland title of all time, Room Temperature.
But then Vox, it gets start getting very
Sex in the Head.
Yeah, well, and Sex in the Hand. That was the first masturbatory book he wrote, but I enjoyed it. To say, not on that level.
I didn't like Vox at all. The Fermata had possibilities.
Yeah, well, I actually think the Fermata is a very, very interesting book, but it's also extremely excremental and off-putting on the level at which I think he's attempting.
Joyce is like that too, though. An unusual interest in secretions and. But you find Joyce does it very beautifully. I mean,
it's part of life. It's not part of my life. I've never actually written a letter to my. I think
letters are different. And what is it?
It's to Nora. They send a pair of your knickers, but make sure they're not washed. Huh? Wear them for 2 weeks.
And don't pull the chain. No, very curious. But the shithouse scene in the early pages of Ulysses is beautiful.
One of the good scenes. Actually, the last part of the book is the first part I read, and I don't think I've ever read the book consecutively in my life. And I'll certainly never do it to Finnegan's Wake. I think you're perfectly right about Finnegan's Wake.
Finnegan's Wake is a 700-page crossword clue, and the answer is the.
But that is style gone mad. Style can go mad.
Well, he did a ridiculous thing. Tell a dream, lose a reader, said Henry James, and puns are cornerly but rightly considered the lowest form of wit. So he thought, I'll do it this way.
And anyone can do them, yeah.
Dreams and puns.
Craig Raine did make a at least halfway telling point. He said a book that took 30 years to write, well, you can spend some time reading it. It's not that point.
Yeah, and great big books have a way of brushing aside, little criticisms. But it's more a sense of what you lose, what you've lost in Joyce. You could have had 2 more Ulysses. My father always used to talk about introversion in Joyce's case. And a writer should always be a good host. Nabokov would put you in his best armchair, serve you his best wine, and be fussing about you. Joyce would come in, he'd be vaguely off in the kitchen somewhere making,
After borrowing money from you.
and sort of, looking among the old wine bottles and said, I'll be out in a minute, He didn't love the reader. An important point.
I like the way you defend Larkin. I've done the same myself. I can't imagine how anyone ever had any other attitude except to defend one of the great poets of our time. And I thought what has been happening has been an intellectual disaster on a particularly squalid level, and it comes out of goodwill. It came out of the goodwill of preserving his remains, publishing the letters, reordering the poems to put in the poems that he himself had cut out, and you come up with a picture of a man whose work was actually infected by what it seemed to be his obsessions. It's simply not true. His obsessions were kept for his private life. He knew what they were.
He was historically very unlucky to have his letters and his poems come out and his biography at a time when PC was feeling its ode.
He was always unlucky to have kept them. It was the librarian in him, I think, burning his letters.
He burned his notebooks, and they're apparently a real vision of absolute hell.
We can be sure of that now because they're gone. Yes.
Yeah. But I think he identified these weaknesses, and he kept them out of his own selection of his collected poems.
What I thought was particularly sad about the reaction was that, having known him, not to the extent you did, but I knew him reasonably well in his later life, and it was impossible to imagine him being discourteous to anyone of any sex or any colour, anything else but punctilious, gentleman.
No, as Kingsley said at his funeral, he had this almost effusive sympathy and restrained, sensitivity. It was just he said, these are just my private ways of going grrr. It's letting off steam. Unfortunate. I mean, also, as a social being and as a discursive being, he should not have allowed these inherited propositions to. He should have examined them and seen that they are cliches of a different kind. He didn't do that, and that's part of his, his screwed upness.
Yeah, there were neuroses.
Yeah. One of those old styles. Was it natural screwed up guy? I mean, that I said there's more insight in that than the 600 pages of the biography.
I don't mean to suggest that in your criticism that you necessarily worship every writer on every level, particularly the ones you admire most. And you knew Larkin's limitations as a human being, and if possible as an artist, although as an artist I don't think he had many. But I particularly like the way you write about Bellow. And he obviously means a hell of a lot to you personally and as an artist.
He does, and I get more and more, privately overwhelmed by how good I think he is. I think he's certainly the greatest American writer.
There's so much in the prose, isn't it? That's nutritious prose in a way that.
It's weight of voice, and it's not a stylistic trick as it sometimes seems in Nabokov. It's weight of soul is really what it is.
I love the way when you unpack a sentence of Bellow, you're actually unpacking perceptions, experiences. He condenses. He gives you so much. But let me raise the question here, in the most awkward and sensitive possible point. Does it ever bother you that, for example, Bellow, how many times have you been married now?
5.
It's not hard to guess that the previous wife is cropping up as a character in the latest novel and so on. Is this proper? Is this?
Well, as Philip Roth said, when a writer is born into a family, that's the end of that family. But it isn't. It's not true.
It's the end of a whole street.
No clan. But it isn't true. And I don't know quite what Philip Roth had to suffer in that department. I know he's written to redress the distortions that have been saddled on his family with.
I wouldn't try and catch Bellow out on that point. I would say his attitude on Israel would be regarded as simplistic, especially by liberal Israelis who happen to live there. He wrote one book about Israel, which I simply thought wasn't very good journalism. It was brilliantly written, but
To Jerusalem and Back, where I don't think the Arab point of view has much gone into.
Right? You can say that again.
Well, James Wood, a marvelous critic, one of the few remaining critics, wrote that he was reviewing the disgraceful biography of Bellow, where the biographer James Atlas gets himself in a taking about the fact that an entirely sympathetic minor character in Humboldt's Gift was based on a friend of Bellow's, who was very upset. And James Wood, I think, crossed a good line when he said, well, that's just too bad. You know, it doesn't, in the end, matter whether this guy who works in tiling minds that he's a sympathetic character. It doesn't matter. I'm afraid.
Whenever I'm making fun of Mailer, which one way or another, and sometime or another we've all done, for some of his crazy opinions and actions, I try to remind myself that he wrote The Naked and the Dead.
I'm reading with Norman on Friday night. Yeah. In New York.
Oh, in New York. Yeah. We were about to leave for the airport. I've always wanted to do an interview with you when you're on the way to the airport.
But if somebody told me I'd be reading with Norman Mailer 30 years ago, I'd have said, I'll settle for that. But Harlot's Ghost is a great book. The Oswald book is terrific.
That was going to be my point. It's not only did he write The Naked and Dead, he's got this disconcerting ability to do it again, especially after you counted him out. And Harlot's Ghost is an extraordinary piece of work.
In fact, the idea that there are no second acts in American lives is bullshit. Always was. And medical science is, Bellow wrote Ravelstein, published Ravelstein at the age of 85.
I once took apart one of Mailer's books, a book about Marilyn, which is a joy piece of extremely questionable research and argument. And I really took it to bits. And then I met him in the back of a limousine in New York about 5 years later, and I know exactly the way writers remember reviews. I thought he was going to get punched out, even though he was with his current family. And he couldn't have been nicer.
No.
And there's no more threatening-looking man. Have you ever seen a neck like that on a writer? His ears sit on top of it like bookends on a shore. I thought he was going to deck me, but he was very nice.
Well, what was that line where he looks into the eyes of the heavyweight champion?
Oh, that was Sonny Liston. He actually, I think he was writing about Muhammad Ali. And it's a classic piece of Mailer. This is the high style. Taxed to the limit. He actually suggests to the reader that when he and Liston faced each other at this bar, Mailer says, I thought I saw a flicker of fear in Liston's Well, a man bold enough to write something as silly as that.
No, that's what's so great about him. In that oral, or better say verbal, biography of him, incredibly damaging, he was a very wild guy. I mean, he couldn't sleep without a fist fight every night.
But one puncture point that we could never get over is he actually did stick a knife in one of his wives to see what it felt like, and it didn't feel like very good for her, by all reports.
No, it was a serious incident, but he was crazed on drugs. I mean, and booze.
I don't no doubt he was. Yeah.
I know. Well,
last time you were crazed on booze and drugs, did you stick a knife in anybody to find out what it felt like?
No.
Existentialism, he was calling it. Yeah.
Does this affect his book?
See, that's worse than silliness. I think over the Jack Abbott case, it was silly. Yeah. Actually, the Jack Abbott case came out of a good side of his nature. He thought Jack Abbott, who was a prisoner, was a talented writer, did a lot, along with the New York Review of Books, did a lot to get Jack Abbott sprung. Jack Abbott rewarded Mailer and all the people who got him out of jail by, the first night he was in a restaurant, he stabbed a waiter and killed him. Promising young writer. And Mailer, we would have thought would have been obliged to admit when he was quizzed about it on television that he made an error, and he said something very, very silly about, I think it was a challenge to the suburbs or something. Existential crap again.
So literary integrity is worth a few losses in the suburbs.
If you're talking about a man who really can't talk sense unless he's producing art, it does introduce an extraordinary division in the mind, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it's become completely clear to me, over the last 30 years of my life that fiction, at any rate, doesn't come from the front of the brain, but from the back. So all the dross in the frontal brain is sidestepped by the unconscious. That is what talent means. So you can, up to a point, you can separate them.
I think you're commendably brave about finding something unreadable when it is, even though its reputation is international, huge and continuous, like Don Quixote, which you didn't enjoy.
Totally unreadable. Well, the second half.
What does unreadable mean? Is the inability to continue is what I would...
The unreadability means you wouldn't do it unless you were reviewing it.
And you know that nothing is going to happen in the next few pages
and you're constantly wondering what else you could be doing.
I've actually got a book like that in my life. It's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which I've been reading now for 40 years, and I'll never get past volume 1, because Gibbon's style is highly crafted, fantastically intricate, baroque, indeed rococo, but basically unreadable, because it's all style. He's incapable of a statement, of making a statement in a way that merits the case.
He's sort of cultish too, isn't he?
Yeah, the sort of 8-part sentence, all carefully balanced, exists in itself as a construction. And I think there is such a thing as a style that gets out of control through being too controlled.
Well, then it's not a proper style. Style should is just an expression of perception. It's not something poured on afterwards. It's inherent in how you perceive. And if the reader is constantly stubbing his toe and veering back, then it's because the style isn't a true style. It's an imposed one.
Well, I think you better get to the airport and stub your toe on Norman Mailer. We'll do this again. But